our second session of the day. Feel free to get up and get water, anything you need. But we're going to go ahead and get started. And again, we're going to try to stay as on track as we can. So for this next session, I want to introduce our moderator before we begin. Rahne Alexander is an intermedia artist and writer from Baltimore, Maryland. She is a 2021 graduate of the Intermedia and Digital Arts MFA here at UMBC and a 2021 Baker Artist Prize awardee. Her works in video, performance, music, and painting have been exhibited across the United States and around the world, including the Baltimore Museum of Art, Tefra Institute of Contemporary Art, and Mix, New York. She performs music as 50-Foot Woman and The Worms, and formerly fronted the bands Santa Labrada and The Degenerates. Her writing appears in publications such as Be More Art, The Hopkins Review, UMBC Magazine, The Light Ekphrastic, Flux, Come Sail Away, On Curating, and the Lambda Literary Award-winning anthology, Take Me There, Trans and Genderqueer Erotica. Alexander's 2019 outright award-winning chapbook of collected essays, Heretic to Housewife, was published by Neon Hemlock. She currently has work on view in Baltimore at Maryland Art Place in the Bureau of Queer Art show Dismantled, group show, as well as Back East, a two-person collaborative exhibit with Aaron Stellman at Current Space. Back East will close November 2nd with an artist talk, so stay tuned for that event. I'll also introduce our first speaker in this panel, James Smalls. We're happy to have him fresh from France, semi-fresh from France. James Smalls is professor of visual arts in the area of art history and museum studies. He is affiliate professor of Africana studies. His research and publications consider the intersections of race, gender, and queer sexualities in European art of the 19th century and in the art and visual culture of the Black diaspora. He is the author of Homosexuality in Art from 2003 and The Homoerotic Photography of Carl van Vechten, 2006. His current and future research and publication projects include Féral Benga, African Muse of Modernism, As Gay as It Was Black, Art, Queer Networks, and Interracial Sociability in the Harlem Renaissance, 1925 to 1939, Baltimore's Outsider Within, Race and Queerness in the Photography of Amos Badacher, which is in that book, American Modernism's Slippery Slope, Classicism, Primitivism, Ethnography, and Sculpture, and Queer Harlem, Gay Sociability, and Transatlantic Modernism. Today he will be giving a talk called Gossip, Hearsay, Innuendo, Recreating an Archive, the Case of Féral Benga. This because this is a trackpad and so it gets a little
what murky. This one down one?
Right there.
That one, okay. Right. Thank you, Beth, for that that introduction. Ugh. Let's see here. So, Beth, when I was asked to participate in this, Beth asked me to consider my current research in terms of archives. So my current research is on a Senegalese dancer and artist model whose name is Féral Benga, who's pictured here. And this research is vested in the idea of remembering and preserving at least the visual memories or the residue of a Black life, his efforts and contributions, his memorialization and self-representation vested in transitory materials and ephemeral performances. Now, the amount of written and visual information on Benga is scant compared to that on Josephine Baker, on whom Benga modeled his career and public image. Although Benga's life and career were just as complex and fascinating as hers, for a variety of reasons, mostly based on his gender and his sexuality, And as a result of a dearth of archives related to him, he was and still is deemed less significant to the history of Black diasporic art and modern culture. Therefore, my research on his life, his career, his legacy, his visual strategies of self-promotion, and his representation by others and cultural impact on gay and Black diasporic contributions to modernism, all of that constitute a significant challenge. There exists no credible biography. There is no firsthand accounts of Benga's life. Any archives from which to cull information are oftentimes dispersed and or fragmentary, and available sources of promise are typically anecdotal, gossipy, highly suspicious, and sometimes really wrong, unreliable, all right? I have been thinking about the relationship, actually, of gossip, hearsay, anecdote, and innuendo to the archives and to my own pleasures, as well as frustrations in conducting this kind of research. So archives, as we know, can encode all kinds of meta-narratives that confront, intervene in, disrupt, and or derail standard forms of inquiry. And it's been argued, and I believe there is validity in this, that in gossip, for example, one can find a radical model of modern and postmodern knowledge, which would serve well in the reading, reconsideration, and rewriting of racial, gendered, and sexual historical narratives. However, when there are gaps or fissures, as we was mentioned this morning, in the archive, critical fabulation, which is a methodology that Saidiya Hartman has become known for. That critical fabulation has become perhaps the key methodological strategy for a lot of queer history, including queer art history, a lot of women's art history, and other histories of marginalization. So creating archives of the speculative sort serve really as anecdotes against forgetting. Perhaps in the context of Black diasporic and queer art, we have to accept such approaches as one way of writing ourselves back into history, art history in this case. So creative or speculative archives raise questions about what counts as knowledge and what are appropriate objects of study in specific disciplines. For my own research, gossip, hearsay, innuendo, and anecdote constitute a legitimate part of the imaginary or the speculative that needs, however, to be approached cautiously. So my research often involves piecing together archival fragments and then critically, or maybe not critically, but responsibly, is what I call it, as well as sensibly speculating on their connections, their strength, and their weaknesses. I've learned that speculation in terms of art history is a dirty word, but I use it, I do it, all right? And I explain my speculation, why I speculate the way I do. However, recognizing that archival fragments can be distorted, exaggerated, misleading, or outright false, I make it a point to keep in mind and to question or at least remain skeptical of archives as sources of information or sources of the truth, right? So in this respect, I think archives should not be viewed as an objective or unmediated representation of the past. And as Jacques Derrida, the French philosopher, has warned, there is a danger of taking the archive as fetish, of believing that the archive is a literal substitute for truth or the reality of the past. So a certain amount of romanticism, he says, remains about archives, that in them linger a kind of assurance of that there's a concreteness or objectivity or recovery or wholeness in archives. And so he referred to this, Derrida referred to this kind of archival romanticism as archive fever. That's what he called it. Archives, of course, for Derrida are not neutral, nor are they innocent. And so I recognize that when I'm dealing with this topic here. So I'm going to give you some information on Féral Benga because a lot of you don't know who he is. A lot of people don't know who he is, even though he was extremely popular in the 1920s and 1930s, not just in Paris, but in many parts of Europe and as well in the United States. He was known here, but we don't know anything about him. Now, in 1923, at the age of 17, Francois Benga left his native Dakar in Senegal and traveled with his father to Paris. His father worked for the colonial administration in Paris. It was while on this trip that Benga decided to run away because his father treated him very badly. And there's actually a reason for that, because he was claimed to have been illegitimate, right? Even though his grandfather was one of the wealthiest property owners in Dakar. Anyway, there were some family issues there. So he ran away. He worked odd jobs to make ends meet. Yeah, in 1925, the same year that Josephine Baker appeared in her La Revue Nègre, Benga, learning that the Folies Bergère was on the lookout for black dancers, he auditioned and he was hired. When he did this, he made it a point to introduce himself to Baker, becoming instantly enamored with her persona. It was upon meeting her that he decided to adopt for himself a stage name, and that name was Féral. Féral, like a feral cat, which in French means untamed, wild, promiscuous, right? So he names himself that, and within a few years became one of the star attractions of the Parisian music hall scene. Known for his physical dexterity, his impish good looks, and his carnal choreography, Benga gained a popular reputation in Paris as the male counterpart to Josephine Baker, with whom he became very close friends and danced with periodically at various entertainment venues throughout Paris. Interestingly, in none of the archives with Josephine Baker is Benga ever mentioned. She doesn't mention him once, ever, in any of her writings or any archives associated with her, which is weird. They were really good friends, right? All right. Anyway, from the mid-1920s into the 30s and 40s, Benga appeared in a barrage of on-stage tableaux, some of which exploited primitivism and exoticism. He became the darling, what they call le chouchou, of the international elite dance and performing arts circuit, and attracted the attention of some European and American modern artists who included, and I'm going to show you pictures by these artists, Richmond Barthé, George Platt Lynes, Pavel Chelychev, James Porter, Eli Lothar, Jean Cocteau, Carl Van Vechten, right? These are just some of the people who became enamored with Benga and used him in their works. In April of 1926, as part of Baker's African dance troupe, Benga appeared on stage as one among other African male dancers who pounded the drums while accompanying Baker, starring as a character whose name was Fatou, in the Folies Bergère revue called La Folie du Jour, as she danced her infamous dance with the Girdle of Bananas. You've heard all that story, right? So this is when it happened. And the revue was staged as a heterosexual male fantasy full of racial stereotypes, designed to entertain white colonial fantasies of taboo and desire. And so you see, by the way, there's Josephine Baker there in the photo on the right, and right to her left there is Féral Benga, right? So he was part of her troupe. She had assembled this African troupe, right? And he was part of that, and here he is here. He's here, right? When she comes down the tree in her girdle of bananas and all that, her banana skirt. So shortly after this April debut of La Folie du Jour, Benga drew attention to himself when he danced in a revue called Tout pour Josephine, Everything for Josephine, in which he displayed his comic as well as dance talents by performing a drag homage to Baker. And so that what you're seeing there is an actor named Dorville, right? And you see Josephine Baker there. I'm talking about the bottom part of the photo. That is Benga and Josephine Baker drag. Up on top is an actual picture of Josephine Baker, so it's a pastiche there. However, it didn't just end here, because Féral Benga would go on stage to perform in Josephine Baker drag, performing very complicated dances, right? Here's an example. image, and here's another one. And by the way, these images of Benga were sort of publicity photos that he had commissioned. In fact, many of these images of Benga were publicity photos that he had actually commissioned from certain photographers, right? So he wanted himself to be seen in a certain way. And in this instance, seen as emulating Josephine Baker. He didn't just adore Josephine Baker, he wanted to be her, right? And was determined to model his career after her. This would not be the last time that he would appear on the same stage with his idol. The two remained very close friends and continued to perform together periodically at the same major Parisian entertainment venues. That's why it's so odd that he is not mentioned in any of her archives. So from 1926 until 1940, and the reason I use 1940 as a cutoff date, because that was the date, that was the year that the Nazis marched into Paris, and Benga stayed in Paris when the Nazis arrived and had to go into hiding. And there's a whole story after the war, what happens to him, which I can't get to today, but there's a whole story about Benga and what happens to him after the war. So from 1926 until 1940, Benga's career blossomed as a dancer and music hall celebrity, likened to Josephine Baker's sexy and sauvage persona. In fact, here are some more publicity images, how he wanted himself to be presented, right? And it's interesting because he commissioned it from Wallery, is the name of the photographer. And Wallery was known for doing pictures of showgirls, right? And in the Folie Bergère, there'd be like naughty pictures and what. And so Benga explicitly went to that photographer and said, I want you to do me like this. I want you to represent me like this, right? And so these are a couple of examples of that. There are more, there are lots of them, these images. So Benga eventually caused quite a stir in the vanguard interracial negrophile circles of Paris, Berlin, and New York City in the early decades of the 20th century. So my project considers the performative self-stylings, the visual representations of Benga by a handful of transnational, transcultural modern artists and critical thinkers of the first half of the 20th century. However, despite his popularity and influence during the period in question, Féral Benga is all but forgotten today. He's forgotten. Even though we have these photographs, right? He's forgotten. Barely a footnote in the history of European and American modernism. So my project claims to change this by focusing not only on the life and sociocultural import of this very intriguing African, because he's got some really interesting, he's interesting, right? He was interesting, but on also the visual and social encounters with his physical presence and his cultural influence through various mediums that include painting and sculpture and photography and film. So I argue that Benga's physical presence, his social and ideological impact and import underscore the tenuous and ambiguous interactions, conflicts, and collaborations that occurred across the French, European, and Euro-American Atlantic from the mid-20s until, again, 1940. He was a literally embodied translation of the Black Atlantic in that he was a site, meaning a social location, as well as a site, meaning a visual manifestation of cultural, racial, and political crisscrossings. So he's, again, connecting African, North American, and European ideas about modernism. So Benga's physical and cross-cultural presence highlights the existence of a Black agency in the formation as well as in the deformation and reformation of 20th century modernist thinking, practice, and experience. So his presence as both a person and an icon operated to activate and challenge racial, gender, sexual strategies of liberation within the assumed stable dimensions of early 20th century modernism. Perhaps even more important to my research is that, or what I think is more important, is that Benga's presence on the modern scene between the two world wars brought not only Africa, but also the silence and the willful blindness to homosexuality and the homoerotic into the orbit of modernism and Black Atlantic discourse. He's very unusual in terms of, he's really the only one who did that, right, during the period. His indulgent, self-fashioning tactics and the visualizations of his body by others were deployed as subversive signs of participation in a modernist culture of affective and aesthetic desire, want, and need, fostered by a cadre of inter and transnational, inter and intraracial male modernists who set out to disrupt and illuminate those conundrums of race and sex and class in the modern era. So I contend that Benga was their muse, and I use that word interestingly, muse, because muses are usually women, right? So I contend that Féral Benga was their muse, critical to both their own creativity and status as modern artists, as well as for social and cultural critique. So Benga's corporeality, his body as physical and social presence in modernism, really functioned to center blackness and gayness, right? This is, and you know, to center those things from the margins as necessarily linked aesthetic and ideological category. Now, doing this research presents a challenge due to the lack of any centralized repository and collection of artifacts on Benga or the Folie Bergère for that matter. I was really surprised to learn there are no archives of anything that was performed at the Folie Bergère, right? There's no art, they don't exist. So therefore, in this research I do, I have to resort and rely on gossip, hearsay, anecdote, and innuendo, right? These are, of course, unconventional avenues of investigation, typically rejected by the academy and traditional art historical practice, but I have found these things to be delightfully productive, delightfully so. Now, in addition to an array of photographs, paintings, sculptures, films produced by anonymous and known artists of this period, our primary knowledge, or I should say the most knowledge of Benga's life and hint of historical significance comes to us from two, admittedly gossipy, anecdotal, exaggerated written sources. And that's what you're seeing there. The written sources are Geoffrey Gorer's popular book called Africa Dances, a book about West African Negroes, which was published in 1935 and dedicated to Benga, right? And a 2004, much later, autobiography in which Benga figures prominently, titled, and I'll give the translation here, Memories of African Theater Inside and Outside of Africa, and written by Maurice Sonar Senghor. And if that name sounds familiar, it is, because he was the nephew of Leopold Senghor, who was the first president of Senegal after decolonization, and he was a Benga protege. Right? And another problem I have with this research, and especially that source, is Senghor indicates that Benga was genealogically related to him. So if that's true, then Benga's genealogically related to the Senghors. That's amazing. But I don't know if that's true or not. I have no idea, because he says a lot of things that are not exactly accurate. Gorer, a British anthropologist, made Benga's acquaintance in 1935 and wrote his book in that year to document a journey that these two men had undertaken at Benga's invitation through various parts of West Africa, including Senegal. And here I have a photograph that I came upon. That's what's interesting about this. I can tell you my story about eBay and how I acquired a lot of these images that, like this one, for example, that show Gorer and Benga dressed as if they're going on safari or some sort of expedition, but I have no idea if that is connected to their trip to Senegal. But anyway, that's all I have, right? These kind of images. So the initial purpose of this trip was to witness firsthand different kinds of African dance and to enable Benga to recruit and form a handful of native dancers that would form an all-African troupe that would be staged specifically for European and American audiences. He's doing what Josephine Baker had done. He was part of that. He wanted to create a group on his own. So Benga's goal was to revalorize an authentic African patrimony in Europe and America that would operate subversively within colonialism by destroying the hierarchical hegemony of Western dance, which was considered superior to African dance. Unfortunately, for financial reasons, this dance troupe never materialized. It didn't happen, all right? Now, Gorer's book, which is popular and read by Anglo and Francophonic negrophiles of the period, gives us some indication of Benga's reputation and cultivated celebrity status that contributed to his and was enhanced by the mystery surrounding his private life and his mythical vices, according to Gorer. So Gorer tells us that, and I'm quoting Gorer, if he, Benga, had love affairs, they were not known about, and he was practically never seen in fashionable houses or nightclubs. That's a lie. First of all, they were lovers. Right? That's a lie. Okay, Gorer's heightened attention in his book to the eroticism and exoticism surrounding Benga is underscored by the author's anecdotal statement that the dancer, although shy, had been, and I'm quoting him, I love this, distressed by the fact that because he was a Negro and a dancer, everybody considered that they had a right, if not a duty, to make sexual advances to him. Almost in the same breath, Gorer outs Benga by revealing not only his horror of nightlife and cabarets, which was not true, but also alerts the reader that the fair sex does not appeal to him. He actually says that, all right? Despite Gorer's circumspection about Benga's sex life, the discovery of letters that have come to light from the gay American novelist Glenway Westcott, who, by the way, was an associate of Benga's and part of the transnational coterie of gay cultural personalities who populated the worlds of literature and the performing arts in the first half of the 20th century, reveal that Benga's gay flings were in fact notorious among international gay circles, right? They were notorious, right? As with Gorer, Senghor's account, if we go back to Senghor's account, also provides some indication of that alluringly Féral personality attributed to Benga. So in his souvenir, Senghor affirms that Benga was a showman, fond of pomp and display. That's true, based on the imagery that I've seen. That's definitely true. We learn, for example, that Benga owned a large luxury Art Deco apartment located near the Champs-Élysées, which he acquired from his music hall earnings before the war. We also find out that Benga owned over 20 French poodles, which he personally walked daily by threes while making sure that their fur was color coordinated to match the suit he wore that day. All right, you see, I can't trust this biography very much. All right. So also we discovered that he owned a custom-made De La Haye convertible automobile, much like that one there, that cost him a fortune. Right. So this is what I have to deal with. Right. I have to read this and go, okay, yes. And then I have a lot of other images that I have to figure out how they relate to all of this. In 1927, we do know that Benga secured a gig at the Casino de Paris, joining what's called the Casino Colored Boys. Oh no, already. A term applied to a troupe of black, mostly African male dancers who were hired as exotic spectacles and had danced on stage with Josephine Baker in La Revue Nègre. So I'm going to go off script and just talk from the images here because I don't have that much time. Benga is in a lot of these reviews, right? And there are review magazines that have pictures. They don't say anything about what's being shown, but they show some of these images. For example, in 1930, he was in Un Coup de Folie, which shows, and one of the things about Benga that we do know is that he was known as being this really fantastic dancer who knew African dance moves. He was an expert in that. He was also an expert in ballet, right? He knew how to dance the ballet, and he was also very, very knowledgeable of acrobatics. He was an acrobatic dancer as well. So he was also very sexy, but he was also very athletic and acrobatic. And so he sort of mesmerized people. I'm just showing you other images I've come across showing, of course, he commissioned these as, advertisements directed towards his personality. He also danced on stage with another African who I discovered, Melka Sudani, who I'm trying to find more information on. I found a little bit on her. And though he's danced with her for example, they both were dancers of ballet, right? But also involved in these very primitivist kind of reviews as well. and just showing you some from these programs, what kind of spectacles that Benga would perform in, usually with, he always had, and it was very interesting about him, he had glistening skin. He put oil on his skin so that he's glistening. His black skin is glistening, and he's always dancing with these pearly white women in the Folie Bergère. So that contrast of color, and of course they had color, but the contrast of black and white was very, very strong. It was part of the spectacle of the Folie Bergère. And that can be analyzed even further, but I just wanted to let you know that. Here are some other images in which he danced with Josephine, not with Josephine Baker, on his own. He was also in Jean Cocteau's first, by the way, there are no archives that show Benga actually dancing, right? In fact, that's not unusual, I found out. During that period, no one recorded that because this kind of dancing was not considered art. It was popular entertainment, right? So we don't have that, but we do have how he moves in Jean Cocteau's first avant-garde film called The Blood of a Poet, where he plays the Black Angel. And I have I've analyzed that whole aspect of him in this part of Jean Cocteau's movie in relation to Cocteau himself, who of course was gay, right? And so here's some more of these images here. And then you have interest in Benga by American artists. This is Richmond Barthé, an American sculptor who went to Paris and saw Benga perform in a restaurant bar that Benga owned and operated, and actually served Senegalese food. And Barthé was mesmerized by his dancing. He danced with the saber, and it was so sexy and so wonderful that Barthé used him to influence his own sculpture of male nudes. There's a whole history of that. Here's some more images I've come across of Benga with his dance of the saber. He became very, very famous and popular with this. Then there's Carl van Vechten, who's a person I've written about, a very complex figure, and where you have Benga in these very theatrical poses, right? And interesting. I look at these images and I just have to, I sort of make connections, right? Knowing what I know about Van Vechten, about Benga, about the period, and about the images that I'm seeing. Van Vechten read Guerrera's book. Africa dances, their trip to Africa. So here's a painting by Chelychev, a Russian-born artist, who actually, I believe, one more minute? Yeah. Okay. Was Chelychev introduced Benga to Guerrera. So there's a connection there as well. And he did these images of Benga. George Platt Lyons, I'm sure many of you have heard about him, did several images of Benga. So there's a whole interesting relationship with him. And then this is something that was written by Glenway Westcott in his diaries. He had met Benga, and here he talks about him. And that photograph I actually acquired. Okay, I can tell you later how I acquired it. And here's some more candid photos of Benga in an apartment. You get a sense of his personality. Here's some more George Platt lines. These are in the, Indiana, what is that center for? The Kinsey Institute, right? And then I'm going to stop here, but this is after World War II, Benga actually comes out of hiding. He was protected and had fallen ill, and then eventually opens a club called La Rose Rouge, and there's a whole history of this nightclub and him as being the proprietor of this particular nightclub. And he allows in this nightclub the ability of the young African artists and students to come in and establish performing arts in relationship to negritude through the performing arts, right? And it's actually Maurice Senghor, who talks about that. And so, before the war, after the war. So, you can ask me other questions about archives and Benga later on. But thank you, anyway, for your patience.
Do you have a sheet?
Great. Our next speaker is Alexander D'Agostino. Alexander is a Baltimore-based interdisciplinary artist investigating the queer and otherworldly through dance, ritual, teaching, and visual art. A 2009 graduate of the Maryland Institute College of Art, his work has been presented at Vox Populi, the Walters Art Museum, Transformer DC, and the Museum of Contemporary Art Arlington in a solo exhibition in 2022. His solo exhibitions include the Target Gallery of Alexandria, Virginia, the Bromo Artist Tower here in Baltimore, Maryland, Viz Arts in Rockville, and the Hillier Gallery in Washington, D.C. D'Agostino is an artistic research fellow at the Folger Shakespeare Library and a recipient of the 2025-2026 Ruby Artist Award in Baltimore.
The right and the left. Alrighty. Hi, everybody. Let me get my notes. I feel like this has been such like a geek fest. Everyone's presentation, I'm like, I can't even read my notes. I've been writing so quick, so. I'm gonna take you on a little rabbit hole to talk a little bit more about how I do the kind of work I do. I'm calling this talk Invoking and Embodying Queer Archives Through Ritual, Dance, and Exhibition. So I just wanted to start with a picture. This is where I was born. Not really, but I like to think about this kind of like I come from the woods. I actually have a twin brother as well, go twins, who is an equestrian, and he used to run equine training company in Homer, New York, next to a place that was also like a beef cattle farm. So one year for my our 27th birthday, he brought me here. And then we got a shovel, and I got to dig up some cow bones, because I love bones. And to me, that's not that different from what we do when we're kind of climbing into archives. You have to get dirty, you have to kind of look for something. You're not going to get the whole picture, so you have to figure out, like, was this actually from the cow? This was a cow that was, like, old. I don't think it was harvested for food. So it was still, like, when I first discovered it, it had, like, the rotting guts on it. But then letting nature do its thing, it kind of dissolved. And these bones will show up later. Another kind of forest I like to go into, I think I did something wrong, hold on. Boom. Is it working? No. I'm gonna do that. Let's go to it. So, reading rooms, I love them. This is at the Walters Art Museum in their special collections room, which was my first time ever going to work with archival material. So I was very excited and intimidated. I didn't really know what to think. I'm a huge fangirl of like fantasy stories. So there was this like series called The Discovery of Witches about a witch who's like, I found the missing pages of a spell book. And I'm like, that's my life goal. I didn't necessarily find that. But I did find some queer clues and histories, and so I created a performance called Queer Curiosity. I'm standing with a book I created called The Book of Sodom that pulled images from the Walters collection. So this is from their book. It's a book of 5 poems, or manuscript 666, which is very cool, and they were very excited to tell a witchy girl that they had 666 for me. But as someone who was also a go-go dancer at the Eagle, I could kind of relate to this image of like a ruckus on one side and then like what's on the other side of the curtain and what are people watching. Generally, I would say I'd position myself more as like the person watching. As a go-go dancer, I felt like my role in queer spaces was sort of to create like an atmosphere, to be seen but not touched, which happens sometimes less at the Eagle than other go-go spaces. But for that project, I ended up getting some of my go-go boyfriends, and we created what I thought like the witches of Macbeth might do if they were go-go boys in the back room, which is very different from like when you're on stage. It's messy, it's chaotic. And so we did this bizarre ritual at the Walters, and I would ask people to write letters or, you know, prayers or petitions that the witches would then kind of transcribe into this book that I had created. This was the night of that Kavanaugh testimony, so people were really focusing on blessing, you know, a lot of people. So that what's interesting about that process was that I kind of came away with a collection of handwritten notes and kind of queer sentiments that were a lot of, you know, like fuck Trump and that kind of stuff. But then also a lot of things that would bring me to tears. Like I definitely am a crier. Like if I talk about queer art, I'm like, we're alive, you know, and you know, you need to see images of yourself reflected in the world, or you need to see how you exist sort of throughout history, throughout culture. So that was sort of like the beginning of thinking like, oh, the work itself is the archive, because this was an event that happened that has like a record. So performance art is like an archival moment that contributes to queer history, or that's sort of how I think about it. And I was really excited to keep working and doing these things. Then the pandemic happened, and I had a lot of anxiety. I do live on the dog shit street, so I can see where Divine ate dog shit. And I was having a chaotic argument with a neighbor who we just were getting into a lot of derogatory language. It was scary. And another neighbor came out, intervened, and was like, "Are you okay? We're all fine now." But she told me that she had discovered her uncle's box of gay porn when she inherited his old antique shop. If you live in Baltimore on Howard Street, Antique Row, used to be antique shops. Uncle Frank used to be an antique dealer, and he had a secret box of gay porn that I was given. And that became sort of my social life during the pandemic, was to work with this porn. My partner and I would just kind of take some alcohol wipes and scrub the moldy residue off. And then, you know, I would document them and created a series of prints that I call queer shrouds. I'm not like a real Catholic, but I was a Catholic. I was never confirmed. Once you're Catholic, like, I know. My mom didn't want me to be confirmed because she was like, you don't believe this, you're a witch. Why would you do this? It was just tradition. I'm like a traditional Catholic, and, you know, it's in my family, but that kind of thing. So I call these prints that I make from the porn and other queer archives queer shrouds, because it made me think of like the Shroud of Turin. And so I just started gathering as many of these prints as I could. It became sort of my daily ritual, and stacking them in books that I called queer shroud grimoires. Grimoire is just like a magical book. I know Wicked's a big deal right now. The Gramarye, you know, like spell books and things like that. Again, I'm just trying to create books of magic that reflect my kind of queer horniness and my desire to find echoes of myself throughout history. So that sometimes there are like multiple color prints. I'm using a similar process that you use if you're a cyanotype person. There's a dye called solar fast dyes. You can use multiple colors. It's lovely. So these are some examples of the earlier shrouds. I really love reading the advertisements. I really love like the Dear Sir ads, because you get a sense of local kind of regional desire, and that's really cool. And then it started to become a way for me to kind of collect and gather my own sense of queer history. So if you're like, what's queer history in America? You will discover the Lavender Scare, because that's just how things go. And so I started to focus on the kind of witch hunting and the way that it showed up in both like the US and in European like publications. So, you know, you can kind of see the how to spot a homo. It's very classic, you know, usually like effeminate, skinny, great hair, that kind of a thing. So I created these performances about what I thought the kind of scary fairy would be. and I ended up calling it the Lavender Scary Fairy at a place in DC called Transformer, which is a really cool kind of, I would say, like experimental art space, very punk rock. You can do what you want. They were like letting me burn bouquets of dried lavender in the gallery just for fun. And then I would, flutter around the neighborhood, end up at Logan Circle and hand out people like little bits of lavender, sort of just as this ritual to engage with people after the pandemic. I think someone got COVID right after that too, which is like, it's terrifying. So that was, my experience working with Transformer was like go into the streets, like bring your cicada wings, because it was also Brood X season. And then I started applying for other shows and got involved with the Arlington Contemporary Center for Art, or Museum of Contemporary Arts Arlington. So I thought it was interesting when I started presenting this work in like public spaces that would also have like workshops where kids would go, that the content always needed a sort of content notice. And I don't see that in a lot of other art exhibitions, and I think some art spaces are like, we should never censor things. When it comes to content notice, I think that the first one, this exhibition on view in this gallery contains content that's appropriate only for adult audiences. But I know some adults who don't feel ready or confident, or they don't want to see sexual content in public. So it eventually went from, it's maybe not for kids, and then I'm like, but some people don't want to see explicit material. So let's evolve how we put content notices. But it also becomes a nice collection, and it's sort of a badge of honor for me to be like, that's right, I have like a X-rated situation. And this is what that exhibition looked like. Here's the Book of Sodom. It ends up showing up in a lot of my exhibitions because it's an ongoing process. And I like this sort of idea that a book of magic becomes a story itself. So I had taken all of the shrouds that I had printed. We're trying to figure out which one I'm at. Okay, this is harder to do than I think. So I call my shrouds when I install them queer shroud grids. Kind of like a Ouija board is a spirit board. I like to think that the blend of, vintage gay porn, or if you want to sound fancy, early modern erotica. That mixed with images from witch hunting books and images of magic and personal images becomes this sort of like calling board for the queer spirits. And then I would like lay a bunch of lavender underneath them, and that sort of has become a process for me. And so here, I started experimenting with scale. I made a piece about the James Webb Telescope, because around the time I was putting this exhibition up, there was a petition to name it the Harriet Tubman Telescope instead of James Webb, who was a bureaucrat. He was complicit. He was a part of the Lavender Scare. He definitely signed off on the purging of federal workers in the workforce. I think there was a moment when that name was going up where I was kind of raving on social media, and some of the webs were like, you don't know what you're talking about. For this exhibition, I ended up working with Dr. David Johnson, who wrote the book, The Lavender Scare. He's a little bit more of like an old school, like, I feel like gay historian. It's like the racism in gay porn is just history, and James Webb wasn't bad. And I maybe had a different opinion, but I like that conversation we got to have. And this image you see of the man with his face being covered, that's something that tends to show up endlessly in my work. I like to call him muzzle mouth. It's very much like a reflection of queer censorship that I feel like I have to experience as a person. You often feel like you have to overshare sometimes, or you feel vulnerable when you let yourself out. So there's this, and it's, I don't know, it's kind of kinky too. It's a very powerful image. The image that you can see of the zebra, or the giraffe, is actually a zebra in the Mattachine Society is an early gay rights organization. And the way that they would educate about gay people being different and the same was things like a children's image of a zebra, but gay zebras have spots. So it's still a zebra, but it's different. I thought that was cute. And so that project kind of got me really curious to continue doing research, and I wanted to get my hands on more material, and I needed to be spookier about it. So that's when I got involved with the Folger Shakespeare Institute. The Folger Institute, they're more into like early modern research. A lot of them are like, I don't really like Shakespeare. If you go now, there are sometimes the people who are protesting saying that Shakespeare didn't write his plays. So it's chaotic, but they have a book of magic that has an image, which is what this is, of Oberon, the Fairy King. And my first experience with Oberon was like the early 2000s or late 90s, Midsummer Night's Dream with Michelle Pfeiffer and Rupert Everett. And I remember I'd be like walking my dogs in the forest and like, maybe he'll just be perched in the woods. So it was sort of a queer route for me. So I created the Fairy King's Grimoire, which was a spellbook project that considered both the kind of history of the radical fairies from like the Arthur Evans witchcraft and the gay counter perspective. I'm not like anti-Harry Hay, but it's just not, that's not my radical fairy realm. But I did like Arthur Evans. Like when he moved out west, he called his land New Sodom with the three sisters. So I was like, this is the person. And I started making prints using the dye of the book, but also would print on different plants, morning glories and weeds and invasive species that grow at my house. And then it also turned into a performance art project where I became kind of like the go-go dancer version of Oberon, because dancing on tables is very familiar to me. This specific table is also from the antique shop, so it's an Uncle Frank table. Never knew Uncle Frank. I saw one picture of him. I don't know if I need to know him, but this was his table. And so I did this dance where I was thinking about the Tempest, and when Prospero has this book of magic that he throws into the ocean. And I wasn't going to throw a book of paper in the ocean, but leaves are less of a problem. And so that project was something that was really kind of near and dear to my heart, and it always shows up in my work. It was published in a book called The Art of the Grimoire by a magical scholar, Owen Davies. And his book Grimoires was like my first, like, I really need to refine my knowledge of magic. So it was sort of like a fangirl for full circle moment. And the kind of witch in me was like, this is the spell. So that was sort of something that I was just holding on in my person through all of my research practice, thinking I'm going to look with the sort of laser eyes that I look at vintage porn, that I look at books of magic, and kind of create this queer world or this queer mythology. And then I had another exhibition that sort of considered the missing pages of this book and like, how do I find those? An AI conversation we had. I did try to see if I could find the missing pages with ChatGPT. Horrible, no sense of early modern language. It wasn't accurate spells, but it was an interesting way to think of the internet as like an entity. These are some of the bones that I had harvested years ago. I like to carry them with me around. And this show did also have a content notice. I don't think there were any 12-year-olds who came to see this show, so I was pretty good on that end. But this was at the Torpedo Factory in Alexandria, Virginia, which was a torpedo factory, and then it was a Federal Record Center. And then it also was a storage place for the Smithsonian. So dinosaur bones, Nuremberg trial records, other stuff. And then it was an abandoned factory, and in that sense, it was a cruising spot. So it had like a queer history to it. So I wanted to create work about kind of the digging into the bones of queer Alexandria. So I made a queer shroud grid specifically with the research I had done about Alexandria and the torpedo factory and gay Alexandria. So learning about a bar called the French Quarter that had to paint all of the nude statues with underwear because there was like a lewd, you can't serve alcohol around nude imagery kind of law. So this was an interesting article I found. That's the first casualty in theory of the Civil War, Elmer Ellsworth, who was also one of Lincoln's alleged same-sex lovers. So I thought that was kind of fun to play with. And so the idea of this process for me is, again, speculation, inventing, and imagining. I know I'm not going to be accurate or always correct, but I do think that it's about a sense of feeling and that kind of queer instinct that I call the queer spirits. Books for divination, artist books always are a way for me to process the abundance of information and content without having to freak out about the specificity. It's very much an intuitive process. And then I ended up creating a performance where I got to dance on the World War II naval torpedo that they had. And I wanted to mimic these paintings by a Greek painter. I'm not good at Greek, so I'm probably going to say Yanis Sarouche. Maybe that's incorrect, but he made these paintings of men with butterfly wings, and it just sort of spoke to my desire to kind of wear a pair of boxers and feel sexy with wings. But then I also took actual images from the archives and attached them to the torpedo with magnets. I did a whole invocation for queer spirits. I had people knock me with the big torpedo, so that was a very fun and interesting process. This was for their Pride event, and I think they weren't expecting it to be like performance art. They maybe thought it would be more entertainment. So I was like, what'd you think? And they were like, I have questions. But I like that about it. I like when performance art isn't, entertainment is a byproduct, I think, of the performance art that I do, but maybe getting you to unnerve yourself or to engage with it. So people would start to write questions about things they had forgotten or desires, and then all of that was written on those pieces of paper, and then that's its own little archive that I have in my stacks of collections. That kind of research then got me thinking more about like divination practices and like inventing and speculation, and I'm a tarot reader. So I started bringing my tarot cards to the Maryland Archives room at the Enoch Pratt Library, and I use tarot cards both to like help you deal with the existential crises of your humanity, but also as an inquiry guide for research. So I got to do a performance at the Bromo Tower, and I thought it was interesting that at one point, the big pill bottle that was atop of it was used to kind of help ships come in. So it's sort of a lighthouse. So I wanted to make the light, like, to me, you know, pink is queer, I get it, you know. So we made this pink landscape upstairs in the clock tower, and I thought of it as like a queer beacon. So I worked with local Baltimore DJ, Amy Reed. We created this dance party. She used music from Divine, so it was very like Baltimore based. And then we used, that's the disco ball from the Hippo, which is now no longer a CBS. So it had all these sort of queer rituals. People would come up. It was like really, really hot. It was the night of the Biden-Trump debate. It was very unhinged, but it was really fun to be in this world. And then in the lobby, I had an exhibition, more of the cow bones. The bird cage is also from Uncle Frank, so like there's a theme that tends to show up. And then I was considering the history of the kind of changing landscape of Baltimore's queer nightlife scene. So I created a smaller grid, and I focused on some images that I had gathered of what were gay places, were no longer gay places. Ben's research helped me kind of find some spots. I spent a lot of time after the tarot cards were like microfilm, looking at the gay paper archives at the Enoch Pratt. And so I got a list of all these bars, rode my bike around. This is from the Atlantis, which is a strip club I wish I had been to, especially after looking through some of those pages. I did get to dance at the Night Shift, which was like a blip of a strip club in Baltimore. It was not just like a leather daddy boy vibe, but it was like a gender expansive, under the train tracks kind of vibe. I miss it, I love it, but it was fun. And so I think that when we see images that you can touch on fabric, it becomes a part of this patchwork quilt that is queer identity. It's coming from so many different sources. Do a lot of different things to kind of think about queer history. So that was a busy summer. That same summer I had a show at Viz Arts in Rockville, which also, this was the one that 12-year-olds weren't allowed to be at, but also had a content notice. So I just like to collect those because it's fun. I don't know, I think it's kind of interesting. I like going to, you know, like video store days when there was like the back room you weren't supposed to go to. I think that's fun. And so I was wearing fairy wings and making people tie me up in this little performance. And then the prints I made were all the prints I had made on different leaves, both from my house or hosta leaves that were from my grandfather's garden, then brought to Syracuse where I grew up. Then when my parents moved from Syracuse to Baltimore, they brought the leaves themselves. My grandfather did fight in World War II. He never did drag in World War II, but drag was a huge aspect of the of what soldiers did to find peace and joy during World War II. They were called blueprint specials. College Park actually has one of the original High Yank manuscripts that was basically stage instructions to do performances. It's not like very queer inclusive drag, it's very gendered, very problematic, very racialized tropes, but it's interesting to see images of people in drag in the middle of rehearsal and then, oop, gotta go fight the Nazis. And that's sort of where my head is right now with my current body of work. I'm creating a project that focuses a little bit more on these blueprint specials. So I'm trying to kind of create what I think maybe could have been queer experiences during this interesting moment. You know, soldiers could be kind of queer in World War II, and then they would go home and live these very heteronormative lives. And so I like to think of that weird moment when people were in this horrible place. Maybe also they were finding themselves. And, you know, this could have been a queer person, or he could have just been a guy in a dress. And then, you know, that's part of the game. But part of my approach to working with images and my definition that I work with of queer is just sort of representations of gender and sexual nonconformity. I had always loved the word queer, and then when I heard some Towson University students write about the Book of Sodom project, they use that expression, and I'm like, that's so much easier for me to explain queer as like, this is a gender nonconforming image. It doesn't necessarily mean this person is like a queer person, but it could be. You never know, and I like the speculation of that. That's why I like to use tarot cards when I do the research, because it allows you to use these images and ask questions, and it becomes sort of like an inquiry guide. And so that's sort of where my work is right now, is working with these kind of images. Around this time last year, I presented my kind of research methods in the reading room at the Folger Institute, working with their book of magic. It's pretty old, it's like handwritten, so a grimoire itself has an interesting survival rate if it's existing as a handwritten object. A lot of the images from the book itself are copied from other books, so it's not like a channeled image of a demon. Some of them are actually like images of like Trojan horses and battleships and things that maybe the author magician illustrated as magical likenesses. And so when I would do this kind of reading method, and you can see there's 4 cards, the one on the top left would be the card that I use to consider the provenance of the book. So this book was owned by a lot of interesting people. There was a really weird gender nonconforming person, Richard Cozzi, who was a miniature painter in the US, called a macaroni, was kind of like a queer persona that existed. So I thought, okay, maybe queer people and magic. It's a thing. And then the one in the bottom left would be more about the author of the book, who we can't really figure out who wrote this book. There's a lot of speculation. So it's more what the message of that author could be. The top right would be what the page itself is referring to. And then the bottom card would be like maybe how this applies to my own sense of inquiry, or maybe what question other people ask. So during the event, some people would ask personal questions, and I would use this old book and these cards to give them a very kind of queer and sort of subversive approach to what I think is the practice of research, which isn't to know what you're looking for, but to kind of dig deep into things, maybe hoping to discover things. Sometimes walking away with nothing feels like, ugh, and then you wake up in the middle of the night and you have like a aha feeling. A little bit more of like what that research looks like. So you can see in here I had been able to put all the place cards in the book because I can't read secretary script. I'm not that good with the early modern language. So I had to have a translated copy and make extensive notes. And then this is a picture of Oberon the Fairy King with a light sheet behind it, which is my favorite part of working with old books, is trying to find the watermarks to see if we can figure out where it was printed. But that's just sort of an example of what that research practice looks like. The last time I did something like this was a few weeks ago here, with the 2 copies they have here of The Discovery of Witchcraft, which is sort of a book of magic, but it's also critical of witch hunts. And so it's a really interesting spell book. The facsimile version of it has different formats than the one they have from, what was it, the 1700s or something. But very cool to play with old spell books. As much as I love looking at queer porn, sometimes I think like books of magic become their own interesting subversive landscapes. A lot of the spirits that you invoke aren't going to emerge as like a monster, but often like there will be a spirit that could appear both as like a regal king, but also a young lady. So I like the kind of gender nonconformity of the ethereal realm and of the realm of the fairies. Not just like radical fairies, but fairies was maybe like synonymous with demon or spirit when this book was created. So that's kind of, I thought that was going to go longer than it did. So that's about kind of where this talk goes. If you want to follow me and see more what's going on, you can screenshot this. I do like hearing from people. If you have any insight to the kind of work I'm doing, or if you have any random family photos of your World War II relatives in drag, let me know. If you want me to read your tarot cards, or if you want me to read your library's tarot cards. Yeah, and there's another bone there. It's a human skull, owned by the Folger. If you go into the reading room there, just know that the ashes of the original Folgers are also in that reading room. Folgers like the coffee, so if you're like, it is connected to that. I encourage everyone to go to that library, to this library, to pretty much any public archive. I think that's the thing as an artist I've learned the most, is you sort of demystify the idea that looking at old books with gloves, which no one wears, is a thing. You just go into a room, you have questions, you have images, and there you go. So that's me, and that's you all.
Thank you, Alexander. All right, we have our final panelist here. Dr. Leslie Cozzi is the curator and department head of prints, drawings, and photographs at the Baltimore Museum of Art, where she is responsible for over 68,000 works on paper and has organized numerous exhibitions. including A Modern Influence, Henri Matisse, Etta Cone and Baltimore, Omar Ba, Political Animals, and Darrel, Ellis, Regeneration. She was a 2017-2018 Rome Prize winner at the American Academy in Rome. Dr. Cozzi has previously worked at the Grunwald Center for Graphic Arts at the Hammer Museum. She holds a PhD from the University of Virginia and a BA from Yale University. So thank you. Does that sound familiar?
Yeah. Thank you so much. Thank you to Lindsay and Beth for inviting me here and everyone for coming. I'm here to talk about an exhibition project that I had the privilege to work on that was titled Darrel, Ellis, Regeneration, which was on view at the BMA in 2022. So you're going to be seeing pictures from that exhibition, the sort of pretty after pictures, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the process of getting there. And I will say that there are many people named on this slide because exhibitions are really always a collaborative process. One person who is not named is the person who likely took this photograph, Alan Frame. And it was through Alan Frame, who's a photographer and a curator and a really brilliant polyhyphenate, many things, that I was introduced to the work of Darrel Ellis. Darrel Ellis was an artist. He was born in 1958. He died in 1992. So he had a very short period of activity. He graduated from high school in 1977 and really sort of immediately entered the New York art world and became part of the downtown art scene. And he passed away very prematurely in early 1992 of AIDS-related causes. But he left this sort of remarkable body of work that was quite varied and quite hard to codify. And I think the exhibition that we organized was the first exhibition of his work in many decades. And part of that, I think, was because he was a Black queer artist. Part of that also was because his work didn't really fall neatly into any categories. It was photography, it was drawing, it was sculpture, and it was many of those things at the same time. The two of the main frames that we used in thinking about this exhibition were thinking about the family as an archive and the ways in which he related to his father's practice, and I'll talk a little bit more about that, while also thinking through his process. And the process itself was a really very important part of the work. The first work that I actually encountered or among the first works that I encountered by Darrel Ellis was this portrait that he made after a photograph that Peter Hujar had taken of him in 1989. It was part of a small show at a gallery in the Lower East Side called Osmos, which is a gallery dedicated to modern contemporary photography. And it was recommended to me by Alan, who had been working for many years as the kind of manager of the Ellis estate. Alan had organized a very important show of Darrel's work at Artist Space in 1994. And really the BMA Bronx Museum touring show that we did was sort of the first show of Ellis's work since then. And in that entire interim, basically the work had been living in a self-storage unit that Alan rented in the Bronx. So it was really entirely due to Alan that this work survived at all. His family didn't entirely understand what to do with it, and you know, interestingly, when we interacted very closely with the family in organizing the show, and they kind of joked about like, oh, he always said he was an important artist, but we never believed them. And it wasn't really until he sort of gained recognition that they sort of realized the value of the archive that they were responsible for. This work was made after Hujar had died, and I'll talk a little bit more about the circumstances of it. And I find it quite interesting for the discussion that we're having around sexuality, because to me, there's and sort of to relate it to James's discussion of Benga, Ellis was known in the art world as an artist, but he also modeled for other very important photographers. And Darrel had, because he was this, you know, he was he was sort of a reputed local beauty. But he had a lot of issues with the way in which he was pictured by them. And I think there's a real contrast to me between Peter Hujar's original and the way Ellis represents himself here, because it's much less to me about the kind of languid sexuality, and there's much more of this emphasis on sort of chiaroscuro and psychological interiority. And I think as we were thinking about the show, we were really trying to think about Darrel Ellis's work, not just the ways in which he was excluded from the archive because of his sexuality, but the ways in which he used his sexuality to challenge art historical tropes and to think about specific kind of contributions that he could make to the canon as a result. This is the, oops, it's not, excuse me. Oh no, previous, I don't want that. This is the other kind of response he made to one of his most well-known the experiences of being a model when he modeled for Robert Mapplethorpe. And this work actually got sort of taken up and became was used in the first Day Without Art as the sort of poster work in 1994. Again, I think he pictures himself sort of differently than the way he had been pictured. And when his work was included in the very famous celebrated exhibition Witnesses Against Our Vanishing, he spoke about the way in which he had modeled and had this sort of crystallized his resistance to the frozen images of himself taken by Robert Mapplethorpe and Peter Hujar, and sort of being haunted by those representations. And this idea of haunting and the way in which history kind of haunts the present through the work of art became a sort of structuring motif as well of the exhibition. In large part, that was because of the relationship between Darrel Ellis and his father and his father's archive. His father was also somebody who had quite a really varied history. When he died shortly before Darrel was born, he was the victim of police violence, while Darrel's mother was actually pregnant with Darrel. So Ellis never actually knew his father, but he inherited his father's photographic archive in the early 80s when his mother gave it to him. And his father had a portrait studio in the South Bronx. So Ellis was essentially kind of mediating not just the archive that was a history of art, but this very personal archive in his own work. The ways in which he did that was often by thinking about the process of photography as one where each print is sort of part of a greater series as a sort of serial practice, but also using drawing and sculpture and printmaking to also render each image unique. So here you see two versions of the same vintage negative that he's using to print. You see at right this image where he's printed a black and white photograph, but then he uses pigments applied onto the surface of the print to create this very evocative image. And then at left, what is an entirely paint and drawing media on paper. So he's kind of returning to the same image and rendering it multiple ways, and making each image idiosyncratic and unique in a way that sort of mirrors the function of memory itself, right? That everyone will experience the same moment and remember it differently. Here you see the sort of outcome of that process again. One of a gelatin silver print that's, for Ellis, fairly unmanipulated. You see the sort of direct photo intervention process, and I'll walk through that in the next slides, as well as a version of it where he's taken one of his rephotographs and then transferred that into a drawing media. So how did he make these sort of strange surrogates? I want to walk you through the process because it's quite quite fascinating. He didn't simply take vintage negatives and print them. There was always multiple steps of mediation. So here you see the sort of camera setup where he was using an enlarger, and then the tripod, his camera on the tripod. And then at the base of the enlarger, you see this sort of interesting idiosyncratic shape of what is actually a plaster relief. He would make these sort of plaster sculptures. And then they often had these, either they were, sometimes they were kind of organic shapes, sometimes they were geometric shapes, but he would sort of create these recesses in these plaster surrogates and put them on the base of the enlarger. And then he would take a vintage negative like this one, and this is one of the Ellis family, a portrait with his mother and father and older sister Lori from the 1950s. And he would project the negative onto the plaster cast in his home studio darkroom. Then he would take a photograph of this projection. Click, right? And I have to, I did not make these, I will say. I am not that smart. And that would yield a new negative. But if you printed the new negative, you'll notice in this negative, you kind of have a problem, for those of you that are like photo nerds, because it's not actually a negative, right? The lights and darks aren't reversed. So if you printed that, you would get the negative image. So he had to make a new negative from his negative, a kind of what we would refer to as an internegative, which actually reverses the lights and darks, so that when you print the final image, it appears, the lights and darks appear in the correct, not orientation, but the lights are lights and the darks are darks. So this process was the sort of key for all of his work. And he developed it in the late 70s when he was a resident at PS1 with a fellow photographer named James Wensey. But he continued to use it with multiple subjects over the course of the next decade. And even though interestingly, when he first received the negatives, his father's vintage negatives from his mother, his first response to them was to use painting and drawing to translate them. And he didn't really start applying this process of sort of photographic mediation until later in the 1980s. So we spent a long time, or one of the sort of focuses of the exhibition was to really kind of try to get the visitor to understand the sort of technical complexity of this process and really walk them through it. And there was, I will say that like the amount of meetings that we had just about how to phrase this one didactic panel was probably about like 16 hours of discussion just to sort of try to make that process explicit. We also were very much guided by Ellis's own writings and his own language. He left volumes and volumes and volumes of notebooks. And he talks about the 3D geometrical shape functioning as a way to enter the 2D of the photograph, which is quite fascinating because on the one hand, this quote suggests that this process and this form of engagement was a way to be in community with these images, to sort of make them his own, and for the viewer to also sort of enter the image. But at the same time, it was really, so he was reconstituting the family in a new guise. But at the same time, that was sort of elusive, right? Because he was not actually able, he never experienced this joyful family that was being pictured, right? That had already dissolved the moment he was born, and he was sort of born into an incredibly tragic situation that was marked by extreme grief. So he was also using the photography to kind of meditate on absence and loss, and the way that the thing that is represented was never there, at least for him. And some would say maybe never existed at all, right? And so this sort of intersects with these discussions we're having about the sort of fabulation of the archive. And so I think when you go back to that image, it really sort of brings home this idea of, that the access to his father's memory, as much as he was working directly with his father's negatives, was barred to him. And I think the placement of his father's face relative to this projection is quite interesting, because those recesses in the geometric shape literally read as bars, right? They like read as gaps or sort of physical lacuna in the image. His father was working with a kind of accordion style camera, large format 4x5 negatives, and he was working not just with physical prints that were remaining from his father's practice, but also with contact sheets that his father had made. And so there's an interesting dialogue where you can see him kind of annotating the contact sheets that his father had made in terms of which images that he thought were most interesting and the ones that he wanted to engage with. And so that process of selection was quite fascinating. It becomes very much a sort of meditation on portraiture and the group portrait, while also thinking about interiority, the domestic space, and then also things like the automobile. And so there's a really lovely kind of resonance between that image of the automobile and some of the work in this lovely exhibition. Here is an image of a group at the party. And so this scene not just gives you the sense of the sort of family in the home, but the structure of the home itself is something that he was interested in thinking about. He was an incredible avid consumer of art history. He also was a teacher of art history. He taught for the Whitney Museum's Arts Reach program, which brought art to public school children in New York. And there's really fascinating ways in which he left documentation in his journals about how he was trying to rethink the syllabus that he got from the Whitney to expand it to include Black artists, which in 1983, when he was doing that, really wasn't sort of canonical yet. But he was also somebody who really was fascinated with 19th century French art. He talks about how he grew up loving the European history of art, the way that Bonnard or people like Vuillard could paint their family in an interior, the Bonnard's wife at the kitchen table, and that was natural to him because that was his first subject matter as well. That he was painting this image that you see in the vitrine at the right of this slide is what we believe to be his first, what he considered his first mature painting, and it's an image of his younger sister. Sitting in their family apartment with the sort of lights of Bronx windows illuminating behind her, and it's a very kind of neo-impressionist style. So he was clearly sort of thinking about that as he was learning to become an artist, and there were fabulous examples in his notebooks of sculpture from the Met that he was sketching. I mean, he really taught himself the canon as a way to sort of break out of that canon. And then you can see in that image the really lovely example of his sister's hair being done, right? So these kind of intimate moments that he varies their scale and plays with in fascinating ways. The figure of his mother was as important, I think, as a kind of pivot or linchpin as the figure of his father in how he thought about his work. The image at left is a print that is actually a negative. It was actually printed by Thomas Ellis, and so it's one of the sort of examples of his father putting his lens, capturing with his lens family life. But it's to me, it's a very kind of horror image in terms of art history. It's a woman at a window, right? There's this sort of idea of kind of mimesis and naturalism that is contained in that device of the window. And yet there's this incredible play of shadow and light that creates this kind of hypnotic mood that I think I very much associate with Darrel Ellis's work. And then you see Ellis, again, recreating that work in another media in this really amazing wash drawing. And that drawing is from 1983. So you can kind of see, again, how he used drawing and painting as the first kind of surrogates before he applied this photographic process to it. Here are two more examples of the photography and printmaking that he did using his mother as the model. And these are, again, based on images that his father had taken of his mother originally when she was young. Again, this was not his mother in the way that he knew her. They had a very complicated and quite difficult relationship. And I think in some ways you see her, on the right, you see her in this very sort of 1950s, 40s, 50s trope of like what the sort of a beautiful woman looked like in that moment, right? She's kind of a fashion plate. And then in the photograph, you see the placement of that recess obscuring her face. And so you get a sense of the kind of alienation he experienced within his relationship with his mother, who did not accept him for his sexuality and also didn't entirely understand his vocation as an artist, and the way he's sort of mediating that through his work. The sister Lori, his sister Lori, who was his oldest sister, she was the family member who actually knew his father, often became a stand-in for him. Because she was somebody that had experienced this sort of idyllic family life that he had not. And there are at least a dozen, probably more examples of him mediating on this particular image of Lori on Easter Sunday as they're going off to church dressed in their like Sunday best, and she's holding this little plush bunny. I find this work to be quite fascinating because I think it's an indication of his engagement with art history. There's a really incredible James Van Der Zee photograph of a young child in a casket with a plush bunny sort of situated on the top of the casket. So I think it's sort of, he's thinking about other exemplars and then sort of imagining them, sort of revisiting them in his own practice in different ways. But I think one of the other really interesting aspects of his practice, beyond the ways in which he's mediating on the family as an archive in and of itself, was that he was also thinking about the personality of the individual as an archive, the idea of human nature and the sort of individual as its own kind of composite. And so he left behind a remarkably vast and varied body of portraiture that he started doing kind of early in his career and really accelerated as he was grappling with his diagnosis, which he grappled with privately. He didn't really share that until he was very, very ill. And so there was a section of the exhibition that was really dedicated to the ways in which he sort of questioned the limits of representation of portraiture. So you see here the images of the painting that he made after Peter Hujar, the drawing that he made after Robert Mapplethorpe. Again, that was a work that he created in multiple versions. And then that image at far right, is an image, a drawing he made after a photograph of him in his studio that Alan Frame had taken. So he was sort of he was using other photographers' images of him as a way to think about the self as something that was contingent. He was also spending a lot of time playing dress up and sort of putting on personalities as a way to sort of think about these questions and to think about the ways in which he was being perceived. Here you see an image where he's taken he's put on his museum guard uniform. Towards the end of his life, he worked as a museum guard at MoMA. And he rephotographs himself in that guise. And here, you can see the contact sheet of the sort of straight images, straight images and whatever that means. But unmediated, I guess I should say. Even though they're performative, so already they're always mediated from the get. But he's taken that image of himself in his that self-portrait as a museum guard, and he's sort of used projected it onto those reliefs and rephotographed it. But as you see in the contact sheets, he's also doing other things. You see images where he's holding a gun and pointing a gun. So he was very interested. He had a kind of burgeoning awareness of the ways in which the media was caricaturing Blackness as a form of criminality. And so he's playing with that idea. He also dresses up as a Black Panther. So there's different ways in which he's engaging with not who he was, but how he was seen as a Black man. And then I think amongst the most remarkable of that set of images is one of the images that he made towards the very end of his life, this image, the untitled self-portrait at the far right of this slide, which you'll see is dated 1990-91. Again, he really sort of got to a period in his career where he was very much engaged with self-portraiture as he was confronting his own mortality. I will be earlier than that, I think. As he was sort of confronting his own mortality, that he knew that he had very little time left. He had sort of fallen into comas. His health was very dire. He lost a lot of weight. He recalls in his journals being thrown out of restaurants because their owners just assumed he was indigent, even though he wasn't. He was in fact better off in his career than he had ever been. He had received a fellowship from New York State. So this image at right, which is kind of remarkable technical work where there's actually sand and other kinds of substances that are added to the painting to kind of create this materiality, and then he's using a palette knife to kind of scrape that skull cap into the surface of the painting. But he's presenting himself with his hands out in this gesture as if he was panhandling. So he's sort of showing himself as the indigent that he was being presumed to be, that he was very much not. Which I think is an incredibly and one of the reasons that I think this show happened was because this was one of the first works I saw that Alan pulled out of the studio, pulled out of the Bronx storage unit, and it was, it was unframed. It was just kind of, it hadn't been sort of dusted or cleaned in 30 years, but it was like you could just tell it was this sort of remarkable summation and contribution to the field of portraiture. So I suppose one way to kind of end this disquisition is to think about the ways in which so many things, identity, the archive, and the process of exhibition making are really a collective process. And so thank you so much for this invitation. Oh, I just meant to say also, the book is here for anyone who would like to look at it. Thank you.
Thank you, Leslie. Go ahead and invite our three panelists to our table here for the Q&A. And welcome our moderator, Rahne Alexander.
Yeah, this distance is a little disconcerting. It's all good. Can you hear me way down there?
Yeah.
At least I get this cool, tall chair. Hi, everybody. My name is Rahne Alexander, and I have so many questions. I have copious notes. We have limited time, so I'm going to try to distill it down a little bit. James, I love that you began by talking about archive fever. As an artist who has worked with archival things a lot, all through today's presentations, I've been thinking about that moment of that discovery, that gasp, and kind of how addictive it can be. there's so many tensions between, the passion, the urgency, the finances, lifespans, and there's so much to be discovered. How do you avoid archive fever?
Are you asking me?
All of you.
Oh. I don't want to avoid it. It's interesting because when I wrote the book that I wrote many years ago on Van Vechten, in the introduction, that's actually what I said. I went to the Beinecke because I was told, oh, there are these interesting images by Van Vechten. I opened the box, and I literally gasped when I saw the photograph. And immediately I started thinking about, how do I talk about these? These are fantastic. So, I love that. And the same with Benga. I've discovered things about him, and I just love that. So I wouldn't want to give that up.
Yeah, yeah. And maybe to add to the question, like, how do you know when it's the one, right? How do you know this is the project that I want to do now?
Well, when I think about it, when I see something and I think about it, it's expansive. I think about the context. I think about, the potential doors this could open in terms of discussion or direction.
Mm-hmm.
So it's organic. That's what I love about it. You can go into archives or encounter sort of imagery, and if they spark questions, then it takes you off into various areas. It's not, and that's what I love. That's what I love about it. Yeah.
Yeah.
I will say that I am, maybe I'm more of a pessimist than I realize, but I don't really believe in love at first sight, and I think that sort of applies to the archive in a way. I will say when I first saw Darrel Ellis's work, I thought, oh, this is really interesting. I think this is really interesting. Am I crazy in thinking this is really interesting? And then I talked to a lot of people about it. Like I did, I think, and the engagement with that work evolved over a multi-year process where we acquired 2 works for the BMA in 2019. And then a year later, I proposed an exhibition, but COVID, so then everything changed, and it took, there were many vicissitudes, but it was in the process of conversation with other people where I had a chance to test my hypothesis that it was interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Because I don't think those decisions are made in a vacuum. Or at least for me, it's a collaborative process, and yeah.
Well, I think there's just when you discover something or see something, there's usually something about it, inherent about it, that sort of attracts you. Yeah. And I would never say, am I crazy to think this is really interesting, because I think it's interesting. So maybe others don't think it's interesting, but I do. And then thinking about how I can expand on that it would not just be that thing, but it would engulf a larger perspective. Mm-hmm. So I guess I do believe in love at first sight.
Yeah, it seems like it's your job then to really convince the rest of us that what you're seeing in this, this thing that you're actually able to see or understand from this archive.
Right.
And some of us are going to be easier sells than others, obviously.
I definitely have archive fever all the time. I feel like it's invited anticipation of getting information that will inspire me. I think artistic research is a fancy word for calculating how you could get inspired. But there's something usually it's an after effect. So when I saw that image from manuscript 666, I was like, wow, they were doing this back then too, because to me, my sense of queerness as someone who was born in 87 was a very polished shave, the healthy fit male identity, the history of the AIDS plague was sort of quiet. So I feel like I'm always in this kind of false sense that everything is new with queerness. And so it's very humbling. I'll come back home, remember after that Walter's session, and I just was crying because I was so happy to see an image of witch hunting and then an image of queer sex. And it sort of creates all these things in my mind, and that's where the urge to dance and move and make art is, I guess. byproduct of that fever. I don't know. I love the term archive fever. That's really
It's good.
it's like a,
But it also seems to me that, like I said, you have to, I think, go at it with the idea that you're not going to get at some sort of definitive truth, because it doesn't exist. There's no truth. So in a way, it's a sort of an act of creativity of the researcher to be, to sort of create these archives or create them anew or create the histories around them. It doesn't mean completely fabricate it, but I mean, based on other things that you know.
Yeah. And I think, well, this is getting at one of my notes that I have a very unformed question around, which is something you all talked about to a certain extent, and the earlier presenters too, around like speculation, reinterpretation, that queer instinct, but also that artist instinct. Obviously, truth is at the root of some of these explorations. And there's things we can only speculate on versus the things we can like diagnose, say for sure. But I don't even know what the question is here. I feel like, can we speak to like the way that this might come off as a particularly queer pursuit to both look for truth and understand that like speculation or reinterpretation, especially across decades, is going to help us arrive at some truth that's meaningful for now?
Well, I don't know. I think it's, I think about Saidiya Hartman and her critical fabulation, that whole sort of approach. It's about the cracks and fissures in the archive or histories, and then how do you sort of salvage something that you obviously care about, right, or are interested in. And so archive fever is the way to, that's the way to do it. It seems to me that's the way to do it. That's the way to, and also you're engaged in that. It's not some sort of detached. I guess each one of us has our own reasons for, gravitating towards the archive and trying to fill in those gaps and fissures in ways that we're searching for or we see fit.
Sure.
I think being an artist, I always have to remind myself that the end game or the goal will be something that is art. And there's a lot less rules, I feel like, in artistic scholarship or research. A lot of it is I'm choosing to invent a story based off of the tea leaves of the past. I think that's where I play with the idea of divination as a way to respond to the unknowns, because I think you're able to kind of surround an idea. And then to me, the art reflects both the personal excitement that I get when I see things, this sort of need to express and tell everyone I know. I could be, like I teach yoga, so I might tell my yoga students, I was just in the archives and I saw these like amazing spell books, and they're like, great, what are we gonna do? But it's this desire to just like share with as many people as you can this feeling of, oh my goodness, that's, very abstract. And so instead of thinking I'll ever know exactly what I was looking for, I always think that if I invent a story, maybe I can find the pieces to justify that or give it some weight.
But it seems to me your stories are attached to something. They sort of,
yeah.
you say something, and that's what I loved about your talk. You say something which I thought, whoa, that's really sort of off the wall, but that is actually connected to that, and that makes sense, and that's really an interesting thought. It's an interesting, perspective. So,
I've always thought like at art, like the one thing I love about art as like an intellectual process is that you are connecting the dots, not just for yourself, but for other people. Sometimes just an image next to another image can give you so much information. And that's, to me, what makes it fun. We think this one image is exclusively a channeled image of a spirit, and then you dig into the archives and you're like, no, this is just a drawing of a physical abnormality that was described in a weird way that the artist copied. Or with, the gay pornography collections. Like, for me, I'm not able to really know these individuals. I don't know how they want to be represented. But at the same time, there's this, like, feeling of humanity that I get. We're like, oh, well, this person's also sitting in their house barefoot with, like, a cigarette, and they're horny, too, or there's, like, a cat in the background. I'm like, wow, we've been doing that forever. an affirmation of like the shared human rights, maybe.
Yeah, I was going to say that I think for Ellis, there was, like, not only was he speculating about the ways in which people were seeing him, but there was an inherent, like, sort of speculativeness in his practice that made it very hard in some senses to kind of actually create a kind of reliable sort of, like, all of our dates were sort of fudgy. Like, we didn't, and it was particularly difficult to understand what things he had done versus what things he had just imagined doing in his notebooks. Like, he really was interested in how you could concretize the two-dimensional photograph and make it 3D. And so there's all this writing in his notebook about, like, oh, I'll use holograms and I'll do all these other things, and which pieces of tech he wanted to buy. And some of them, at one point we thought maybe we found the enlarger that he actually owned, because somebody thought they had it in their basement, and then they didn't. So, there was, like, a lot of attempts to really make it concrete and prove it, and we could only really go based on what he, what the evidence of the artworks themselves, which is what you're doing with Benga, and also his own sort of HIV status was, for him for a long time, it appears to have been at least speculative. The first time he mentions it is in a notebook from 1983 where he says, "Do I have AIDS?" And it's the only line of text in the notebook. And the rest of the notebook is filled with him writing down numbers from the I Ching. And there's all these other notebooks where, like, there's one notebook where there's this whole series of pages where he tried to develop a kind of art history, like a mystical system of art history based on the birth and death dates of major French 19th century artists.
Oh, that's cool.
And so you just have, like, but it's like, it's very arcane. Yeah, it's super cool, but entirely arcane and very hard to understand, like, how do you present that or contextualize it? Yeah,
I feel like you're having your presentation kind of be the final piece of these today's afternoon session, is that here's an artist that's working with an archive, but is still looking for himself within it. Mm-hmm. And, I feel like, correct me if I'm wrong, but I feel like so much of what does drive my own archival research is a little bit of that search for self. Even if I'm doing something that's a little distant, let's look at Baltimore's queer community of, the 20th century. There's a part of that that's like, where am I in this, and how can I situate myself within it? So I'd imagine that is driving each of your projects a little bit as well, right?
Yeah, I feel. Yeah, go ahead.
No. I was saying, for me, in a historical perspective, yes. In other words, as an art historian, there are things I like, and there are things I don't like. And I'm not going to bother with the things I don't like. So, if I find someone or something intriguing, I would want to pursue that with all my art historical training. And then I would also be aware that sometimes that art historical training prevents me from doing what potentially could be. And I have to be aware of that. As I mature, I get aware of that. So,
right. Yeah, should we do a couple of questions from the audience? You want to come up, or?
I actually have a question. Or does somebody else?
There's somebody coming up.
I wanted to say thank you, first of all, for your guys' talks. They were really, really inspiring. And thank you for introducing me to the work of Darrel Ellis. Because now, I think I was here maybe when it was happening, but I didn't know. So that's really great. Something I guess I've been thinking about since Ben mentioned, like, this idea of queer people being alienated from our histories is, like, it's so hard, I think, to make the better worlds that we want when we can't even imagine them. And part of the role of the artist or the archivist is to bring these histories or these ideas of, like, possibility into people's imaginations, right? And so I guess my question for all of you is, how do you think about that part of the work, the, like, how people will perceive or engage with the archive or queer history in your art-making processes, or, like, in how you choose to either present the work or even, like, create it?
I mean, I've found working with like porn specifically, I'm always shocked by how much more people know, and then also how little people have known things. Like one person saw my exhibition, they're like, I didn't even know there was gay porn in the 50s. And, I like to think that the experience that you get from art is multiple things, so you can't just pinpoint it. You can have your exhibition statement, but I like when people come and have like an emotional response.
Yeah.
I want someone to have like a feeling, so if there's the smell of lavender, and then they're looking at like porn, but then there's like a Frank Kameny gay rights protest, they're starting to like, have all these things kind of like put something in them. So they kind of have their own personal moments that I can't control. And that's sort of what I like to hope for, maybe.
It's really cool.
So for me, as a historian as opposed to an artist, I'm much more interested in finding those omissions of queer people and putting them back in that history, or putting them in that history. So for me, with Benga, it has to do with modernism, right? The whole question of modernism and how this particular individual used certain strategies in order to insert himself into modernist language, right? Which is usually, particularly like primitivism. You think about primitivism, which is typically a very heterosexual view, a sexualization of women. Well, here's a person who's sexualizing himself, and he's doing it himself to attract women, but also to attract men, right? And so I think that's interesting. That's very, very powerful, and people in the past have not recognized that. So I see that, and that's really, how did he do that? And how is he sort of using the tools that he has at the moment to insert himself into this this modern trend as a queer person? He wouldn't think of himself, of course, as a queer person. He would not have done that. But yeah, that's historically that's what I'm interested in. All right.
Right. No, that's really cool. I think like what you mentioned with Benga specifically of like how you can trace this narrative of a queer person inserting themselves into a narrative, how that resilience and strength and dedication has always been there.
Right.
I think that's comforting from a present point of view, you know?
Well, no, but it wasn't easy.
Yeah.
I'm sure he didn't live. His life was problematic. I mean, he was it wasn't an easy thing, but I think he was very courageous in attempting to be part of all those sort of vanguard movements, the conceits and of modernism and all that. He's very much so was, even though we might think he's a passive victim, he absolutely was not.
Right.
In the way that Josephine Baker was not a passive victim in terms of her engagement in primitivism and all of those things. All right, so these were, these people had agency.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, I also am not an artist. I'm an art historian and a curator, and I think I see a lot of what I do as learning from artists and of making knowledge that might not be accessible through the curatorial process. And I will say, as Beth knows, I'm working on an exhibition that will be coming up at the BMA about the history of photography in Baltimore. And so this is a PSA for anyone who's, we are doing this project, and we are basically inviting people to tell us what we don't know about this history, about which very little has actually been published. And there's no real, there's no source to go to. There's no sort of systematic overview of this. It's a subject in many ways that has been sort of left out of mainstream normative histories of the medium. And so we're asking people who have archives from different communities to come, I will leave out my card, come find me, we want to know what we need to make available. I think, I don't find the curatorial viewpoint to be, as a friend of mine once said, nobody visits the grave of the curator. And I think that's true. And I think that's good. I think that's important.
Do you have more time for questions? Or?
Thank you guys so much.
Thank you.
Okay. All right, so we are going to take a break, but we can continue the conversation. I wish I was in control, but let's continue the conversation during the break because we do have a hard out at 5, right?
Yes, why don't you ask your question out loud, and then this is a question that we will all discuss.
Ooh, I love this.
During the break.
All right, so I love your presentation. I love this whole day. It's beautiful. I'm reading Invisible Man right now, and I'm in the first few pages, and I got stuck because it was just so amazing. But where I'm at is where they talk about the responsibility of not just authors, but also like artists, their social responsibility when they create, especially fictional characters, and creating them pretty much with depth. And so like my question, and it rolls off a lot of things you said about the fact that these folks had agency and folks may not be able to see that, is basically like, in what ways do you express the depth that, you know, some of these folks had? How do you do that? Because to me, it's a transcendent practice where you have to be able to rise above things and see how things were portrayed, but understand the mindset these characters had and their grit, tenacity psychologically that may not be expressed within archives. So how do you show that, and in what ways do you make it so to unlock some of the psychological and psychosocial power within our contemporary times with all of us as actors in that? So that was my question.
I love this question. This idea of like, how do you do justice to all of the individual lives that are or aren't at all preserved in the archives, and recognize that each one was an individual who had agency. We are going to break, but I think that would be a great question to bring back up actually at the end of the day, because I feel like it speaks to Shan's presentation as well, and which is coming up, and maybe all of the speakers will be able to kind of weigh in, because I think that's really at the heart of what today is about. So let's all take a break, and we'll be back, let's say like 3:20, we're gonna, like Shan, we will introduce Shan. So that gives us like 15 minutes. Thank you.